You open the fridge in the middle of a hot night just to feel that cold air on your face for a second, and you grab a bottle of water so cold it almost hurts your teeth. You do not think about it. You just expect it to be there, waiting every single day of your life, every single summer, no matter how hot it gets outside. Now imagine waking up on a July morning and knowing that the milk you bought yesterday is already turning, that the meat in the kitchen has a smell you are trying to ignore, that your baby has been sick for 3 days because of something in the food, and there is nothing you can do but wait and hope the fever passes on its own. Imagine a whole season of your life built around avoiding spoiled food, around eating things half rotten because there was nothing else in the house, around watching people you love get sick from something as simple and as ordinary as a glass of milk left out too long. That was simply life, every single summer, for almost the entire history of humanity, in almost every corner of the planet. People did not get sick because they were careless. They got sick because there was no way to stop heat from rotting everything they ate. And nobody, not doctors, not scientists, not anyone, really understood why. And the strange part is that the solution to all of this did not come from a genius in a laboratory, funded by a king or a university. It came from a young man in Boston who, in 1806, had an idea so ridiculous that his own brother called him insane, and his neighbors laughed at him in the street whenever his name came up at dinner. Frederick Tudor was 23 years old, the son of a wealthy and respected Boston judge, and he was standing on the edge of a frozen pond outside the city one winter morning, watching workers cut large blocks of ice with handsaws, when he decided to do something nobody in the world had ever seriously tried before. He wanted to load a ship full of that ice, sail it down through the heat of the Atlantic, all the way to the Caribbean, to the island of Martinique, and sell it to people who had never in their entire lives touched something cold. To everyone around him, the idea sounded like throwing money straight into the ocean. Ice melts. Everyone knew that. Even children knew that. How could you possibly carry frozen water across thousands of kilometers of tropical ocean and expect to sell anything but a useless puddle of warm water sitting in the bottom of a ship? But Tudor had grown up with frozen ponds in his backyard every single winter of his childhood, and he could not stop thinking about the heat of those southern islands and how much people there would pay for something as simple, as small, as ordinary to him, as a cold drink on a burning afternoon. To really understand how strange this idea sounded at the time, you have to picture what daily life looked like before any of this existed. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, no cold storage of any kind for ordinary families. Meat was kept alive on the hoof until the very last possible moment, because once an animal was slaughtered, an invisible clock started running and there was absolutely no way to stop it. Families salted, smoked, pickled, and dried food obsessively, not because they enjoyed the taste, but because it was one of the only ways to survive the gap between harvests. Cellars were dug deep into the earth, specifically because the ground stayed cooler than the air, and even then, food still spoiled within days. Markets in large cities ran almost entirely on a daily rhythm built around spoilage. Butchers slaughtered animals at dawn, specifically because anything left unsold by midday would already be losing value, and entire households planned their meals around what would rot first, rather than around what they actually wanted to eat. Milk soured within hours during the summer heat, and contaminated milk was quietly and without much public discussion at the time one of the leading causes of death for infants living in crowded cities, a danger so common that some doctors simply advised mothers to avoid giving their babies milk at all during the hottest months, which of course created its own problems. Doctors of the era had no real understanding of bacteria or germs, so they blamed bad air, blamed the season, blamed moral weakness, blamed almost anything except the real culprit, which was simply heat acting on food with nothing in the world to slow it down. Wealthy households in colder climates sometimes had access to ice cut from frozen lakes in winter and stored in deep underground pits packed with straw or leaves. But even there, by the time real summer arrived in July and August, most of that stored ice had already melted into nothing. Travelers crossing warmer regions described entire towns that simply smelled different in summer, a thick, unavoidable odor of spoiling food hanging over markets and kitchens that nobody could escape, because there was nowhere in the entire building, the entire street, the entire city that stayed reliably cool. For the vast majority of the population on Earth, especially anyone living near the equator or in the tropics, the idea of a cold drink, a piece of chilled fruit, or meat that did not carry the faint smell of rot simply did not exist as a possibility, not as a luxury they could not afford, but as something that had genuinely never crossed their mind as achievable at all. Heat was not just an inconvenience to be endured. It was one of the quietest, deadliest forces shaping human life, working patiently behind every kitchen door, in every market stall, inside every glass of milk left sitting too long on a table. Tudor's first attempt at his strange idea nearly destroyed him financially before it had even properly begun. He loaded a ship called the Favorite with roughly 130 tons of ice, cut from a pond near his family's land outside Boston, and sent it sailing toward Martinique in 1806. By the time the ship actually arrived in the Caribbean heat, a significant portion of the cargo had already turned back into ordinary seawater. And worse, Tudor had no proper storage building waiting on the island to protect whatever ice managed to survive the voyage. He lost a large sum of money on that single trip. His family was furious with him, and several Boston newspapers openly mocked the entire scheme as the folly of a spoiled young man with too much time and too much of his father's money on his hands. Most people in his position would have quietly stopped there and moved on with their lives. Tudor instead became almost obsessed with solving the problem. He studied insulation methods for years, reading whatever scientific papers he could find on heat and cold, and personally testing materials in small experimental boxes in his own backyard before risking another shipload. He experimented relentlessly with different materials to slow down melting, eventually discovering, almost by accident, that ordinary sawdust, a cheap waste product that lumber mills were practically giving away for free because nobody wanted it, worked far better than straw or hay at keeping ice solid for months at a time, sometimes through entire tropical summers. He built proper insulated ice houses on the islands he shipped to, so the cargo finally had somewhere safe and shaded to sit once it arrived, instead of melting on an open dock under the tropical sun, while customs officials argued over paperwork. He went deeply into debt more than once, borrowing from relatives who increasingly believed they would never see the money again. At one particularly low point, he was actually imprisoned for failing to pay his creditors, and remarkably, he kept managing his ice business even while sitting behind bars, sending detailed written instructions to his employees through smuggled letters, refusing to let the venture collapse simply because he personally could not walk free. It took him almost 15 long years of failure stacked on failure before his ice trade finally turned a real, dependable profit. And once it did, it grew at a pace that almost nobody around him had predicted, least of all the relatives and neighbors who had laughed at him in the street. By the time you finish watching enough of these stories, you start noticing the same pattern over and over again. One small, stubborn, almost irrational decision quietly rewriting the rules of daily life for everyone who comes after it, often decades or even a full century later, long after the person who started it all has been forgotten by everyone except people like us. And if that kind of pattern fascinates you the way it genuinely fascinates me, this channel is exactly the place to keep finding more of them, because every single week we dig up another forgotten moment just like this one. Some tiny accident or stubborn obsession that nobody at the time took seriously. The kind of story that never makes it into a school textbook, but quietly explains half of the modern world anyway. Honestly, having you here, subscribed, paying attention, sharing these stories with someone else who would enjoy them too, makes all the digging through old letters and forgotten newspapers genuinely worth it. And it is the only reason this channel keeps growing one curious person at a time. The first wave of impact hit the ice harvesting industry itself, and it grew at a genuinely staggering pace once the basic problem of melting had been solved. Frederick Tudor eventually partnered with an inventor named Nathaniel Wyeth, who designed a horse-drawn ice plow that could cut perfectly uniform blocks of ice from frozen ponds, far faster than men working with handsaws ever could manage alone. What used to take a full grueling day of manual labor could now be done in a small fraction of the time, and the resulting blocks were far more uniform in shape, which meant they packed together more tightly in storage and, crucially, melted more slowly than irregular chunks ever could. Entire local economies sprang up around frozen ponds across New England almost overnight. Walden Pond, the very same pond later made famous by the writer Henry David Thoreau, became a major ice harvesting site during these years, and Thoreau himself wrote with a kind of quiet astonishment about watching 100 men cutting ice from the pond he considered almost sacred, hauling away thousands of tons of what he saw as pure, frozen silence. Ice houses the size of large warehouses began appearing along the coastline, packed tight with sawdust insulation and capable of holding tens of thousands of tons of ice through an entire brutal summer with surprisingly little loss, sometimes as little as 8% over several months. By the 1840s, ice was being shipped not just to the Caribbean, but all the way to India, to the American South, and even back across the Atlantic to England itself. A round trip that would have sounded like science fiction to Tudor's mocking neighbors only a few decades earlier. Ships that had previously sailed certain routes, nearly empty, suddenly had a genuinely valuable cargo to carry both ways, which quietly reshaped shipping economics in ports that, on the surface, had nothing whatsoever to do with ice. The second wave reached deep into ordinary social life, and this is exactly where things stopped being just about ambitious merchants and started being about everyone, in every kitchen, on every street. As ice became cheaper and steadily more available across American and European cities, households began buying simple insulated wooden boxes, the original ice boxes, where a single delivered block of ice could keep food noticeably cooler for several days at a time. Ice delivery became a regular, almost rhythmic part of urban life, with horse-drawn wagons moving slowly through neighborhoods every few days, and children running out barefoot to grab small chips of ice that fell off the back of the cart, treating it like a rare treat, because in a very real sense it was. The Iceman became a familiar, even beloved figure on residential streets, recognized by the sound of his cartwheels and the heavy tongs he used to carry blocks up flights of stairs into apartments. A job so physically demanding that it built a kind of folklore around the strongest workers in any given neighborhood. Doctors and early public health officials began noticing something quietly remarkable in their records. Infant mortality linked to spoiled milk started dropping noticeably in cities where ice boxes became common household items, simply because families could finally keep milk cold enough to slow bacterial growth for a meaningful number of hours. Some city health departments later credited the spread of household ice, alongside improved sanitation, with measurable declines in summer death rates among the very young, a connection that took decades for the public to fully appreciate, even after doctors had started writing about it. Iced drinks, something almost nobody outside the wealthiest households on Earth had ever tasted in their entire lives, became available to ordinary working people for the very first time in recorded history. Ice cream, which had existed for centuries as an extreme luxury reserved almost exclusively for royalty and the very rich, simply because producing it required reliable access to ice in the first place, suddenly became something a regular working-class family could enjoy on a Sunday afternoon, and ice cream parlors began opening across American cities by the dozens, quickly becoming genuine social gathering places where young people met, where families celebrated, where entire neighborhoods cooled down together. Even something as small as a backyard summer picnic, with cold lemonade poured from a jug that had been sitting on ice all morning, was, before this, simply not a normal part of life for an ordinary family anywhere on Earth. The simple, almost forgettable pleasure of a cold drink on a brutally hot day something we take so completely for granted today that we barely register it, was, for nearly the entire span of human history before this, something only the wealthiest people on the planet had ever experienced even once. The third wave moved into territory that shaped entire economies and political relationships on a much larger, far more consequential scale. The ice trade eventually turned into a genuine global industry worth enormous sums of money, and it quietly created economic relationships between regions of the world that had barely interacted with each other before. American ice, cut from frozen New England ponds, ended up cooling drinks for colonial outposts in India, supporting British colonial administrators living through a climate that had previously been brutal and, at times, deadly. For European settlers used to far cooler weather back home, with shipments to Calcutta becoming so reliable that ice eventually became cheaper there than it had once been in many parts of Europe. The southern United States, with its punishing year-round heat, became deeply and visibly dependent on northern ice shipments to preserve food and provide any meaningful relief at all from the long summer months, a dependency that created an economic relationship between regions that would later matter enormously and quite politically during the Civil War, when ice shipments from the north suddenly became a genuine strategic and political issue debated in newspapers and government offices alike, with some southern cities scrambling to build their own artificial ice plants, specifically because they could no longer count on shipments from a region they were now at war with. Meatpacking businesses in growing cities like Chicago began experimenting eagerly with ice-cooled rail cars, allowing meat to be slaughtered cheaply in the Midwest and shipped fresh, rather than salted or smoked, all the way to cities on the East Coast for the very first time, which completely restructured where the meat industry could physically operate, who controlled it, and how much ordinary families paid for dinner. Entire fortunes were built and lost on the back of this single shift, and businessmen who controlled ice supply in a given city effectively controlled food prices for everyone living there, a kind of quiet economic power that local governments eventually had to start regulating. This entire wave of growth eventually pushed ambitious entrepreneurs and engineers toward a much bigger, far more consequential question. Could cold be produced artificially, reliably, on demand, without relying on frozen ponds and unpredictable New England winters at all? That single question is exactly what led to the development of mechanical refrigeration, with inventors like Carl von Linde in Germany building genuinely practical refrigeration machines in the late 1870s, technology that would eventually make the entire natural ice trade completely obsolete within only a few decades, turning what had once been Frederick Tudor's sprawling commercial empire into little more than a fascinating historical footnote almost overnight. The fourth wave is the one we are all still living inside of right now, every single day, and its scale is genuinely civilizational. Mechanical refrigeration eventually shrank down from massive industrial machines filling entire warehouse floors into something compact enough to fit inside an ordinary household kitchen. And by the middle of the 20th century, home refrigerators had become standard equipment in households across wealthy nations, with adoption rates climbing from a fairly small percentage of American homes in the 1920s to nearly universal ownership, well above 90%, by the 1960s. The same underlying technology branched off in another direction entirely, giving the world air conditioning, which transformed which parts of the planet humans could comfortably live and work in year-round, turning brutally hot regions that had previously emptied out every summer into permanent year-round population centers. Entire modern cities built on the simple premise that indoor air no longer had to match the temperature outside. A clever young fish buyer named Clarence Birdseye, watching indigenous fishermen in Canada freeze fish almost instantly in Arctic air, realized that freezing food quickly rather than slowly preserved its texture far better. And his discovery eventually created the entire frozen food industry, filling supermarket aisles with vegetables, fish, and prepared meals that simply could not have existed in any previous century. This single piece of household technology reshaped the entire global food system from top to bottom. Supply chains stretched calmly across oceans because refrigerated ships and later refrigerated trucking meant fruit grown in one hemisphere could be picked, shipped, and eaten genuinely fresh on the other side of the planet months later, completely independent of local growing seasons. Vaccines, which require strict and continuous temperature control to remain effective at all, could finally be transported reliably to remote regions of the world, directly saving millions of lives through large-scale immunization programs that depended entirely on something Frederick Tudor never could have imagined: standing on a frozen pond, loading slowly melting ice onto a wooden sailing ship bound for a Caribbean island that had never seen anything like it. Modern hospitals, modern industrial agriculture, modern global trade routes, almost all of it rests today on an enormous, mostly invisible foundation of artificial cold that traces directly, link by link, back to one stubborn young man, proving that ice did not have to melt away into nothing before it found a paying buyer somewhere far from home. And yet, like so many of these stories, the very solution that fixed one enormous problem quietly created a brand new one that nobody saw coming for well over a century. The chemical refrigerants used in early mechanical refrigeration and air conditioning systems, particularly a class of chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, turned out to be slowly and quietly tearing a hole in the ozone layer that protects the entire planet from harmful solar radiation, a danger that was not properly understood or even seriously suspected until scientists studying the atmosphere over Antarctica in the 1980s discovered the damage was already alarmingly severe. International agreements eventually forced a coordinated, expensive global phase out of those specific chemicals, an enormous undertaking that touched nearly every refrigerator and air conditioning unit on the entire planet, costing industries billions of dollars and forcing a complete redesign of equipment people had assumed was already finished and perfected decades earlier. At the same time, modern refrigeration, for all the lives it has unquestionably saved, consumes a genuinely staggering amount of electricity worldwide, and the refrigerators sitting quietly, humming in kitchens around the globe today are collectively responsible for a meaningful slice of total household energy consumption year after year in nearly every country on Earth. There's a second, quieter irony hiding inside the first one. Despite owning more cold storage than any generation in human history, modern households still throw away a huge proportion of the food they buy, partly because refrigeration made food so cheap and so available that wasting some of it stopped feeling like a real loss. A strange kind of forgetting that would have seemed almost criminal to anyone living through the deadly summers Frederick Tudor grew up watching. An invention built to stop rot ended up making people, in a strange roundabout way, more careless about it than ever before. It is the kind of irony that would have deeply confused Frederick Tudor himself, a man whose entire original business model was built on cold that arrived completely free of charge, cut straight from a frozen pond by men with handsaws, melting away into nothing on its own if you simply left it alone in the sun and walked away without a second thought. So the next time you open your refrigerator door without even thinking twice about it, just to feel that small wave of cold air hit your face for a second on a hot afternoon, remember a frozen pond outside Boston in 1806 and a 23-year-old man standing quietly at the edge of it, utterly convinced that something as simple, as ordinary, as a block of ice could somehow be worth shipping across an entire ocean to people who had never felt anything cold in their entire lives. His own brother thought he was wasting the family fortune. His neighbors thought he was a fool chasing a dream that would melt before it ever paid off. Newspapers printed jokes about him at his own expense, and for almost 15 years, the evidence seemed to prove them right. He went bankrupt more than once, he went to prison, and he kept going anyway. One slowly melting shipment at a time, refusing to accept that a problem this small and this physical, water simply wanting to be water again, could not eventually be outsmarted with patience and the right kind of stubbornness. And it could. Slowly, quietly, decade by decade, An entire civilization reorganized itself around the simple idea that summer no longer had to mean rot, sickness, fear, and helplessly waiting for the heat to finally pass. The deadly summers that had haunted every generation before him simply stopped being deadly, not all at once, but steadily, kitchen by kitchen, city by city, country by country, until almost nobody alive today has any memory of what it once cost to live without something cold. One small, stubborn idea, standing on the edge of a frozen pond in the middle of a New England winter, ended up cooling the entire world.